Hebrews 13, which kind of like middle to end of the chapter, it talks about Jesus and compares Jesus to like a sacrifice that was offered for all the people, and then is cast like out of the camp to burn, because that's what you do with the sacrifice. And it pretty much just talks about, like, the Hebrews writer tells the people, like, go and bear the reproach of Jesus. Like, be willing to go where Jesus goes. And so even with his suffering, be willing to suffer, like, with him. And so, and something that we see a lot of Jesus' ministry on earth is his willingness to find those who are not only just in need, but also who are the outcasts, like who are on the fringe. He has like a special place in his ministry for those people, and that's like you see a lot in Luke, but obviously you see it in John too, with him going out to find this guy. So it's just where I think we learn about Jesus in that, like, we're called to share his suffering, but also like he is comforting there as well. Like he understands.
Yeah, and not only like just comforting, but when we share in his suffering, we'll be able to share in his resurrection. And that's something we've spent a lot of time talking about that this semester. And Jesus has dominion over everything. And when we get to share in that resurrection with him, we can be with him. Abigail, can you turn to Daniel chapter 7? Verses 13 and 14. And here, this actually ties into my next point. Is he has this messianic title, and this is actually a callback to this verse that Abigail is about to read.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Daniel 7.
7, verses 13 and 14.
Okay. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory in the kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. That his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed.
So this callback is to a vision that Daniel has. And in this, we see it as Abigail had just read it, that he was given dominion, he was given glory, he was given a kingdom, and literally everything was serving him. All people, all nations, all languages, they would serve him because he has everlasting dominion. And we share in that suffering, he brings us into that glory with him. So going back to the passage, we have verses 36 and 37, where he reveals himself. He says, he answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. So this phrase that he uses, "you have seen him," and it carries the weight, because the man now can see Jesus, and he can now see Jesus physically, because he's not blind anymore. Like, he can see him with his eyes. And he can also see him spiritually. And he gets the picture of who Jesus is, being the Son of Man. And so then, what do we have? Verse 38. What is his response? He worships him. He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. And this verse is a declaration of faith. And it's his recognition of Jesus as the Messiah and Jesus as God. And it points to the application that we should have. That worship is how we should respond to Jesus. Like, that's what we do when we meet here and we worship Jesus. for what he has done for us. So going through all that, we have this transformation of boldness and belief. Ellie, can you read, go back a little, verses 8 through 12?
The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know."
So here the man boldly testifies. And he tells them, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, "Go to Siloam and wash." Basically telling them what Jesus has done for him. So how does sharing what Jesus has done in your life, how does that help you inspire others? It's kind of the flip side of what we talked about earlier.
Gives them hope for themselves.
Yeah, we talked a lot about, like at the very beginning, how we go through all this suffering, how we can share in that suffering through our empathy. But on this flip side, when we have good things, blessings that we get, we can share in this hope. We can share in the one hope. 7 ones in Ephesians 4. Had to throw that out there. But we share in that one hope. And it inspires other people. And when we take a look at all these blessings that we have gotten from Jesus, it inspires hope. And saying all this, it's not supposed to be like when you become a Christian, everything's going to be great. Like we are promised these trials. We are promised suffering. That's going to come. But we are still very blessed. We are blessed with the people sitting in this room. We are blessed with the church. And when we have the church and when we have salvation through Jesus Christ, blessings like that should inspire us and it should inspire other people through our hope. It isn't ready yet. Toby, can you pick up at verse 13 and then go through 17, please?
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet."
So here, the blind man, he hasn't fully recognized, fully seen who Jesus is. So he tells him he's a prophet. And when he recognizes Jesus as a prophet, it shows that growing understanding. He knows that Jesus was sent from God. He hasn't gotten quite the full picture, but he knows he's from God. And then you have the Pharisees on the other side. And they have like a legalistic view that is blinding them to witness this miracle. And they don't see it, ironically enough. So, in our lives, what preconceived notions, what certain biases, I think that's the plural word for it, how might they blind us to God's work?
They won't unless they're wrong.
That's true. This Pharisee view that they had in John 9, it was a wrong view of God. And that's what was clouding their judgment. And it points to the same miracle that just happened here. The blind man could not see. Moving on to...
Jake, one other thing I think about is sometimes when you really, people, have certain preconceived ideas in their mind, and there are things that they don't want to accept, because it somehow or another cancels out whatever their preconceived idea is. And in given the opportunity, they will blame a person for that, even though it's really not the person doing it, it's their own selves, right? They have a preconceived idea they don't want to give up on.
Yes, sir.
And I think about that here, because these guys just didn't want to acknowledge that Jesus was who he was. Well, what do? Well, they try to blame the blind man who was healed, they try to blame his parents, they try to blame everybody but themselves. And we always have to be sensitive to are we doing that or not. And, it'll always be a challenge all of life.
Yes, sir. And you see how that judgment, how that cloud of judgment, it basically turned them against Jesus in that moment. And with that judgment, they couldn't see Jesus for who he truly was. And that was the whole point of the growing understanding of the blind man. And as the blind man was growing to understand Jesus, the Pharisees, they had not realized that. Because they had their own view of what he should be. William, can you pick up verse 18 and go through 23?
But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, and so they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. The Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, He is of age, ask him.
So they call on the parents. They call on the parents in this verse, basically, because they didn't believe like he could have been blind since birth. Like they were trying to find some way around the miracle to discredit it. And when they ask the parent these things, the parents have a chance to be bold. But instead, they fear the Jews, as William just read for us, because they have this fear of rejection. And that rejection can often stifle this boldness that we have in acknowledging Christ. Moving on to the application. How much time do I got? Got about 15 minutes. I have 5 things written down on here, and we'll go through each one. First one we talked about is in these lessons from this encounter is how Jesus meets us in our need. The blind man, as we talked about earlier, didn't call out to Jesus. Jesus noticed him first. And this reminds us of God and his grace. He seeks us out, even when we're unaware of our need for him. Turn with me to Luke chapter 19, verse 10. And here we have Jesus and Zacchaeus. And I'll start in verse 9. It says, And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. That's what Jesus was doing. He was out seeking. And so we need to recognize this pursuit in our lives. So the second thing that I have is that faith requires obedience. The blind man obeyed Jesus' command to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And this was probably a weird command for him. But his obedience preceded his healing. And this shows that faith often requires action. James chapter 1. Who hasn't read yet? I'll give it up. Ken, have you read? Okay, you got it. James chapter 1. Turn there. And read. I think I put the wrong verse in my notes. Yeah, I did. Read 22 through 25.
But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing.
So this faith, it requires our obedience. Much like the blind man had to go do something, he had to go wash in the pool. We too must be doers of the word, as Ken just read. Our faith requires action. The third thing is that his transformation inspires. That says requires. Inspires. It inspires testimony. And the blind man, he went out and, as with a lot of miracles that we saw, he boldly shares his story. And he faces both skepticism and opposition. And he has simple yet powerful words. He says, "One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." And that captures the essence of his encounter with Jesus. He didn't see Jesus. He didn't see Jesus physically, and he didn't see him spiritually. But he saw what came from it, what came from the encounter. He knows that he was blind and knows that now he can see. The fourth thing I have is that spiritual sight is greater than physical sight. We talked about the Pharisees. They had their own preconceived notions. And this Pharisee, the Pharisee's spiritual blindness, it contrasts sharply with the blind man. As the blind man's growing more and more in his spiritual understanding, the Pharisee's spiritual blindness is only clouding their judgment further. And this physical sight that the Pharisees have, without the spiritual insight, it's meaningless. Because true vision comes from faith in Christ. And then the last thing I have today is that worship is the ultimate response to encountering Jesus. When we go through our encounters with Jesus, we talked about 3 different ones. That should be our response. Because we encounter Jesus and we have been blessed with his Son. We have been blessed with God's grace. And our response should be worship. And that's what the blind man's journey ends with here. And he recognizes Jesus as Lord. And that leads to reverence, it leads to awe, and it leads to devotion to Jesus in this passage. Nate, do you have anything to add? I'm kind of short on time.
Well, I had a thought earlier, but then you kept moving, and I was like, I'll just wait. But during the beginning of John chapter 9, with the whole, like, you talked about, I think, reframing suffering, right? And in verse 2, it's just disciples that are asking. And it's like rabbis and religious people that are talking about the whole, like, man, you must have sinned, how does this work, whatever. So the disciples, though, are the ones that ask Jesus, like he's going to have the answer to their confused question. And it's like Jesus kind of takes it as a teaching moment to say, this is what God can do through suffering. And so, and there's a couple things to that. One is that he's encouraging his disciples to see suffering, and eventually he's going to see it through the blind man, to see suffering as you're not necessarily, you can see suffering as like, I'm a victim, and then I'm just going to have to get through this and whatever, and woe is me because I'm a victim. Or you can see suffering, once you reach the point where you're not just struck by the grief of whatever it is, you can see suffering as like God can work through this somehow. Then it's an opportunity. You know, like you get in 1 Peter 4, I think toward the beginning, where it talks about you're going to go through fiery ordeals, but the reason for that is you're going to come out on the other side like gold that has been refined. Your faith is going to be stronger by the time you're through the fiery ordeal, But that never happens if you never face the difficult time or the suffering. And so it kind of shifts your thought of I'm a victim to I have an opportunity. But to put it back in its context is like that, we can take that thought, and that's a helpful thought, but to put it back for his disciples is, I think he's teaching his disciples that same thing, because they're about to go through, they're going through difficult times now, and that just following Jesus and giving up everything that you've done, that is difficult for them, but they're about to go through suffering, where like everybody actually hates them, and they're going to be, martyrs, and they're gonna face this and the other legitimate suffering for the cause of Christ. And Jesus is telling them now, like, all right, you can face this suffering and see yourself as a victim, or you can allow God to work through you as light of the world instead of darkness. And so as disciples, I think, though we are not the apostles, right? Like we're Jesus' disciples we're expected to face the same, in the sense of things are going to happen sometimes because of our faith. Though I don't expect any of us to necessarily be martyred. But the idea remains is, how do you view suffering? Because that will determine where you put your trust, and how you respond to it and get through it, is how you view it.
In this passage, when you think about his suffering in terms of like cause and effect, they keep thinking the preconceived notion there was that it was an effect of sin rather than a cause for opportunity or whatever can come from that. And it's kind of, it's that shift instead of to looking forward. Mr. Jeremy, Mr. Robert, I was just saying if y'all have anything, you can.
Oh, okay. Just two things I thought about. One is right at the beginning, he challenges this thought of, okay, well, somebody, the common thought was, well, the guy's going blind, somebody did something wrong. And sort of what they might call a transactional view of faith. In other words, sort of like, you go to the store, you transact, you give them your money, they give you whatever it is you're buying, and that's the way it works. And of course, Jesus blows that up, right? And that's what he says, no, that's not what it is at all. And you see that in Job, and you see it in other places in the Bible where, we think, okay, well, that's really philosophical, and what difference does that make? How many times in your life have you said, that person didn't deserve that, but they had it, something bad happened to them? How many times have you heard somebody say, oh, well, if you're, there are people that you hear on TV that say, well, if you're faithful as a child of God, only blessings are gonna come your way. Oh, really? I have a lot of people I can point to that are suffering pretty bad things, and they're faithful Christian people. And Christianity is not a transactional deal. And anyway, so he blows that up. The other part I thought about when I think about this particular part of John, it's another one of those examples where Jesus takes the basic physical story, but right translates it into something else. When the classic term is a parable, this is not necessarily a parable, but parable, earthly story, heavenly meaning. Well, here you've got a story, you've got an experience, and Jesus draws a conclusion towards the end. And he does that in Luke 15. He goes through those different examples about this is lost, this is lost, this is lost. But really what he's talking about is the resentful Pharisees, right? And here he's talking, he starts out with a man physically born blind. But in verse 34, he really, not 34, in verse 40 and 41, he really points out who's blind. Verse 41, he says, well, speaking to them, Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, we see, your sin remains. In other words, you're blind. You don't see it. And you don't see what's really going on here. And I just think that's such a powerful thing for us. I don't want to be blind. Frequent prayer I have is, I don't want to miss something. For something, and I think we all think about the Jews and Pharisees and what they miss. Well, I don't want to miss something, right? And this story sort of rings in my head when I think about that. And we don't want to be blind either, so we need to continually be in the Word, we need to continually be thinking about it, and continually be sensitive to the people that are around us.
Yes, sir.
But what I see here, on top of everything else, there's so many layers here. Maybe the most simple thing, but maybe the most applicable for me. And that is the disciples' tendency, at least here, to see a person with a need and turn it into a religious conversation. An issue to be discussed instead of a person to be helped. And when the person is helped by Jesus, who's the only one who seems to care about him as a person, the Jews are mad at him, and the Jews see him as an ally of Jesus or one of their enemies or an obstacle. They don't see him as a person either, to the point that they lose all common sense when they're talking to him. And he pretty much wins a debate with them. You know, the religious elite are defeated in a debate by a blind man who just tells them what happened. And so nobody cares about him really except Jesus. And as we're going through life, I think it is a tendency to take the people that we see in life and the real things that they're dealing with, maybe the differences we have with them or the suffering they're going through, and instead of actually addressing them, we talk about it. And we turn it into a class, or we turn it into a deal, or we turn it into this or that, which is not wrong or bad. Jesus answered the question, but he very quickly turned his attention to that person. And that's much harder to do. That was messy, and that caused problems, and that stirred stuff up. But Jesus did all of that on purpose. And the layers of teaching here begin with him saying, we're not just going to talk about this guy. We're going to go to him and help him. Whatever that causes, we'll deal with it. And sometimes I think we avoid those messes because, a good, rousing religious conversation, is easier.
Yeah. There are a lot of like different forms of blindness. Like that was another one you talked about that I didn't really even mention, was how like they were blind to his actual need, and they were like staying above it and like talking about like the religious conversation involving it rather than his need itself. Any other thoughts before we close? All right, good deal. Appreciate y'all. Have a safe break, and we'll see you next semester. Except Lawson.
Yeah.
And Sharon.
Yeah, actually, I'll make sure Sharon is going to?
Yes.
What, bro?
Trust me, Nate didn't know Sheriff was going either, apparently.
Good job, Jeff.
I appreciate your comments.
That's true.
Bro, what killed me? I didn't have near as much questions as I thought. That was a problem.
Yeah, you're going over to take how many times right now.
Oh, no. I mean, it was just kind of like, I just kind of eyeballed like amount of pages. If it's a sermon, I try to do 6 pages. If it's not.
Thank you.